let me start by saying that for me, the idea of thinking about market forces in low-income communities actually came up in the wake of the Los Angeles civil uprising. In the wake of the LA civil uprising, many of us were running from meeting to meeting, thinking if we went to one more meeting, we'd actually solve something. Have you ever done that? Mm-hmm. You might be doing that now. So, and in the middle of one of those meetings, one activist said there's an immediate need to think long-term. And in thinking long-term, we realized a few things. One was that we needed to connect better to the regional economy and the regional debate. But we realized that when most people thought about how to grow an economy, they didn't take a sort of isolated neighborhood by neighborhood approach. And when you looked at the neighborhoods that were successful, often the people in those neighborhoods were working at other places that weren't in their neighborhood. That when we thought about doing place-based or community development, it was about bringing jobs to the neighborhood instead of about connecting the residents to employment and making the places where people live higher quality places for them to want to stay. And that, I think, is really the fundamental point that I would like to lift. And I think it's a point that Peter, in some sense, was really making as well in his discussion. That for those of us doing place-based development, it's very important to have a regional focus on where are the growing industries, where are the jobs that might be there in the future, where's the workforce development and the transit systems to connect people to those jobs. That is to think about bringing the resources in via connecting to the market for people who live in these neighborhoods. And that means a lot more attention to workforce development that I think has been traditionally a part of place-based strategies, which tend to focus on just generating employment within the neighborhood. Now, the second component to that, and this is sort of my second big point, is that we then need to think a little bit differently about the work that we do in communities. And there's an article that a colleague and I, Rachel Modello-Frost from UC Berkeley, just wrote for Health Affairs. And by the way, I would encourage any of you, obviously, to read it. It's a very good article. But also, if you publish, to publish in a thing like Health Affairs, because these public health journals have impact factors that are like through the wazoo, and your academic career will thrive. So what we did there was try to take a look at the increasing sort of marriage of public health concerns and community development concerns. That is, if you think about the way both of these arose in the past, public health concerns being rooted in urban areas and epidemics and really taking a sort of systemic approach to health, but then since went very much kind of in the field of individualized health insurance and medical care, and has recently come back to the kind of systematic approach of looking at the social determinants of health that Dr. Ross talked about this morning. As they've done that, they've discovered something very interesting. You can only move those social determinants if you change power relations. So what you find with what Dr. Ross was talking about with the TCE building healthy communities is that the things that they're proudest of are the things where the community residents rose up and fought for a living wage campaign for hotel workers in Long Beach, where youth rose up and fought for a different set of truancy policies, where actually community organizing and power building has created the conditions to change the systematic determinants of health. Similarly, for those of us doing more community development or more sort of community-focused work, what we realized was that the CDC field went increasingly in the direction of bricks and mortar, that if we would simply build housing, somehow that would actually improve the neighborhood. And when you begin to then, instead of thinking about just the neighborhood, think about the regional economy and how to affect it, you begin to think about the need to build power. And what was interesting today when Peter mentioned the case of Richmond, which, by the way, opens up all sorts of interesting questions about doing this kind of work in a suburban type setting, is that in the case of Richmond, which is in Northern California, there's certainly an indigenous element that rose up within Richmond, but it was actually also the target of organizing by something called the Social Equity Caucus, sponsored by Urban Habitat, a region-wide power-building effort to try to change the debate about what would be happening in terms of social justice both in city and suburb. And so the sort of second big point is that as we move to this sort of new frame, we need to take place building seriously. seriously, but we need to take power building even more seriously, because people only get attention to their places if they can shift the balance of power. They can only move these outside forces if they also shift the balance of power. The final point I want to make before the sign comes up in a very threatening way is that all of this means that we who are really, what is our next conference going to be about? And here's what I think our next conference really ought to be about, is generating a different economic theory about how to create a more inclusive economy. What is striking to me is that we raise these big problems of widening income inequality, of too few jobs that are being produced, of huge gaps in the middle, of communities being left behind, of dangerous cleavages with increases in poverty in the suburbs, and then we have strategies like raise the minimum wage. That is, they are barely scraping at the surface of what needs to be an alternative economic theory about why inclusion will generate economic growth, and then what are the industries that we want to target to make that happen? What are the selective interventions that government can do that are not market threatening but market friendly and can move things forward in a way that will actually generate both regional and community development in a way that will really make a difference? And in order to do that, we need a lot more theory building about what would be a more inclusive economy. It's something that some of us are contributing to, but it's really at its infancy. The research is increasingly showing that inclusion at a metropolitan level will actually lead to more sustainable growth over time, but that doesn't amount to an economic strategy about how to do inclusion in a way that will be actually also conducive to growth and be friendly to the market as well.